November 9, 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hirschfelder, 38, from Philadelphia, stood in the command post watching his battalion prepare for what intelligence called a limited objective attack. Rain hammered the canvas roof, while mud turned the forest floor into a brown swamp. His men from the 22nd Infantry Regiment had fought across France. They survived Normandy. Most believed this next push would break German resistance and open the path to the Rhine River. Could they know what waited in those dark woods? What Hirschfelder didn't know, within 3 weeks, his regiment would cease to exist as a fighting force. The forest would consume entire companies in hours, leaving survivors who couldn't comprehend the casualty numbers. The 22nd Infantry entered Hürtgen with 2,200 combat soldiers. Command designated their mission straightforward: advance 2 miles through forest terrain, capture the village of Groschau, secure Highway 399. Staff officers estimated 3 days for completion. Weather reports predicted clearing skies. Artillery spotters counted minimal German defensive positions through the trees. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The numbers seemed impossible. German forces held 120 concrete bunkers within that 2-mile sector. But captured Wehrmacht engineering logs confirmed every detail. Captain James Condon, 29, from Boston, led Company G into the forest at WWII 30 hours. His 187 riflemen moved single file along muddy trails between fir trees planted so close that visibility dropped to 30 yards. The forest swallowed sound. Men called orders through the rain, hearing responses from soldiers they couldn't see 10 feet away. German machine gun fire erupted from positions the Americans never detected. Trees amplified the weapon reports into disorienting echoes. Condon's lead squad dropped flat in the mud, searching for muzzle flashes that remained invisible behind camouflaged pillboxes. Mortar rounds began falling through the canopy. Tree bursts multiplied shrapnel effect. What should have been suppressive fire became devastating. The company tried advancing through terrain that offered no cover. Every depression filled with water. Soldiers crawled through streams they mistook for shell holes. Roots snagged equipment. Branches caught on helmets and packs. Movement generated noise that drew immediate fire from bunkers nobody could locate until they opened up. German operations reports documented: Americans advance without concealment. Forest channels their movement into kill zones. The problem: reversing course meant crossing the same deadly ground. By 1400 hours, Company G had penetrated 400 yards. Casualties exceeded 40 men. Condon established a defensive position around a cluster of shattered trees, waiting for support that couldn't reach him. Radio communication failed in the dense forest. Runner teams got lost trying to navigate back to battalion lines. Companies lost contact with their own platoons. 3 companies attacked that first day. Each penetrated different distances into the forest. None achieved their objectives. None maintained contact with adjacent units. By nightfall, the 22nd Infantry occupied scattered positions in a forest that grew darker and more lethal with each passing hour. Sergeant Frank Ripperdan, 24, from St. Louis, spent that first night in a foxhole filling with water. His squad occupied a position they couldn't describe on a map. Trees blocked the stars. Compass readings meant nothing when you couldn't see beyond arm's length. German patrols moved through the darkness, sometimes passing within yards of American positions neither side detected. This would be Ripperdan's defining moment. What happened in those woods would haunt him for 40 years. The morning brought artillery. German forward observers held every advantage in forest fighting. They knew the terrain. They registered fire on every trail, every clearing, every position Americans might occupy. Shells burst in the trees, sending steel fragments and wood splinters downward in lethal cones. Men dug deeper, but the water table sat 18 inches below the surface. Every hole became a muddy pool. Company commanders requested tank support. The forest terrain made armor nearly useless. Roads turned into mud channels. Trees blocked maneuver. The few tanks that attempted to support infantry became targets for German anti-tank guns positioned in bunkers American scouts never located. Crews abandoned burning vehicles, joining infantry who needed every rifle. Staff officers studied maps that showed open ground beyond the first ridge. Aerial reconnaissance detected minimal German presence. Intelligence reports estimated one understrength regiment defending the sector. These assessments came from analysts who never entered the forest, who couldn't comprehend how terrain transformed a 2-mile advance into an impossible nightmare. Could the 22nd Infantry break through? The answer would come through blood and mud that turned the forest floor into a graveyard. Private Robert McDonald, 21, from Detroit, carried ammunition forward on the second day. He followed a trail marked by bodies from the previous day's fighting. Some wounded men still lived, calling for medics who couldn't reach them through the fire. McDonald passed soldiers who'd crawled into shell holes and drowned in the mud. He found foxholes where entire squads died from tree bursts without ever seeing the enemy. The regiment pushed deeper. Companies advanced by yards, measuring progress by trees instead of terrain features. Every gain brought heavier casualties. German defenders occupied prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire. They held bunkers connected by communication trenches that allowed them to reinforce threatened points while remaining invisible to American observers. Battalion commanders received orders to maintain the attack. Division headquarters demanded results. Corps planners needed Highway 399 for supply routes supporting the next offensive phase. Nobody at higher command levels understood what conditions existed in that forest. Weather prevented aerial observation. Communications remained sporadic. Reports that reached headquarters described stiff resistance without conveying the systematic destruction occurring under those trees. By November 11th, the 22nd Infantry had advanced 1 mile. Casualty counts exceeded 500 men. Company strengths dropped below 100 effectives. Platoons operated with 15 or 20 soldiers. Some squads consisted of 3 men trying to hold positions designed for 12. Lieutenant Paul Bosch, 26, from New Jersey, commanded what remained of Company F. He watched his unit dissolve through attrition that never stopped. Wounded men couldn't evacuate. The aid station sat 800 yards behind the front line, but carrying casualties through the forest under fire proved nearly impossible. Stretcher teams took hours for trips that should have required 20 minutes. Some wounded soldiers lay in foxholes for 2 days before medics reached them. They believed better weather would shift the advantage. They were catastrophically wrong. Rain continued. Temperatures dropped. The forest floor transformed into freezing mud that immobilized soldiers and equipment alike. Trench footcases multiplied. Men stood in water-filled foxholes for days without relief. Their feet swelled inside boots that couldn't be removed. Tissue died. Some soldiers couldn't walk even when orders came to advance. German artillery increased. Forward observers called fire on any movement, any position, any target they detected through the trees. American counter-battery fire proved ineffective. German guns occupied positions on the far side of the forest where American artillery spotters couldn't observe them. Shells arrived without warning, bursting in the canopy where soldiers couldn't hear them coming. The 22nd Infantry requested reinforcements. Division sent a fresh battalion. These troops entered the forest with no experience in this type of combat. They died learning lessons that survivors couldn't communicate effectively. The forest created its own rules. Conventional tactics failed. Training proved inadequate. Experience from other battlefields offered no advantage. While companies fought forward, German reserves already occupied defensive lines the Americans would never reach. Nobody connected the pattern for 2 fatal weeks. Staff planners modified the attack plan. Instead of a broad front advance, regiments would concentrate forces for narrow penetrations. The theory suggested breaking through at specific points, then exploiting success. Implementation proved impossible. Concentrating troops created target-rich environments for German artillery. Units couldn't maneuver off the few trails. The forest channeled every movement into predictable patterns. Captain William Pena, 31, from Texas, led Company E in one such concentrated attack. His orders directed him to advance 600 yards and secure a crossroads marked on maps. The company moved out with 134 men. German fire erupted from positions Pena's scouts never detected. Tree bursts killed entire fire teams. Within 90 minutes, casualties exceeded 70 soldiers. The company withdrew, having gained 150 yards at a cost that left it combat ineffective. Similar attacks occurred across the regiment's front. Each resulted in heavy losses for minimal gains. The mathematics proved unsustainable. The 22nd Infantry lost men faster than replacements arrived. Company commanders led units that shrank daily. By November 16th, some companies operated with 40 effectives trying to hold frontage designed for 200 soldiers. Battalion commanders requested permission to consolidate positions. Higher headquarters denied the requests. The offensive continued. Division planners needed results to justify the casualties. Corps commanders demanded Highway 399. Army-level operations depended on breaking through Hürtgen Forest to reach the Rhine River dams. Strategic objectives drove tactical decisions that ignored ground-level reality. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force developed the Hürtgen Offensive through analysis that never accounted for forest combat conditions. Staff planners at Chaef examined maps showing a 50-square-mile wooded area between the German border and the Rhine River. They identified it as terrain that couldn't be bypassed. German forces defending the forest threatened any advance toward the Rhine. The solution appeared straightforward: attack through the forest, eliminate German positions, secure the objectives beyond. What planners didn't know: within 4 weeks, 7 American divisions would enter Hürtgen Forest. 4 would emerge destroyed as effective fighting units. Major General Norman Cota commanded the 28th Infantry Division. His orders directed him to punch through the forest using aggressive infantry tactics supported by artillery and armor. Cota believed his veteran division could accomplish what planning documents estimated would require 2 weeks. The division attacked with 3 regiments on line, each assigned specific objectives that appeared achievable on paper. The 22nd Infantry drew the center assignment: drive east through the forest, capture Grossau, open Highway 399. Intelligence briefings described German defensive strength at approximately 1 regiment with limited artillery support. Reconnaissance reports noted extensive fortifications, but estimated most bunkers remained unmanned. Weather forecasts predicted improvement that would allow air support. Every assessment proved incorrect. How could commanders at multiple levels miss what existed in those woods? Cota's plan emphasized speed and momentum. Infantry battalions would advance rapidly, bypassing strong points for follow-on forces to reduce. Artillery would suppress German positions identified by forward observers. Engineers would clear obstacles and improve trails for vehicle traffic. The timeline allocated 3 days for the 22nd Infantry to reach its objectives. Implementation revealed fundamental problems within hours. Infantry couldn't bypass fortifications they never detected until German guns opened fire. Artillery forward observers couldn't spot targets through the forest canopy. Engineers attempting to improve trails drew immediate fire from bunkers covering every approach. The timeline became meaningless. This would reshape American forest combat doctrine. What happened next would influence training for conflicts 50 years later. The standard American infantry tactics of 1944 emphasized fire and maneuver. Squads advanced by bounds, with one element providing covering fire while another moved. Platoons coordinated their movement to maintain contact and mutual support. Company attacks featured carefully orchestrated advances where each element knew its role and adjacent unit positions. None of this worked in Hürtgen Forest. Squads couldn't see 30 yards. Platoons lost contact within minutes of advancing. Companies operated as disconnected elements, each fighting isolated battles. Fire and maneuver required observation and communication that the forest denied. Soldiers couldn't suppress positions they couldn't locate. Units couldn't maintain contact they never established. Artillery support, the foundation of American offensive tactics, proved marginally effective. Forward observers needed line of sight to adjust fire. The forest blocked observation. Calls for fire relied on map coordinates from soldiers who couldn't determine their own positions accurately. Shells bursting in trees created dangerous effects for friendly forces. Some companies stopped requesting artillery after taking casualties from their own fire missions. The numbers seemed impossible. American artillery fired 75,000 shells supporting the 22nd Infantry's advance. German defensive positions remained largely intact. Tank support, another standard element of American offensive operations, became a liability. The few trails wide enough for armor-channeled vehicles into predictable routes. German anti-tank guns covered every approach. Tanks attempting to maneuver off trails became stuck in mud or blocked by trees. Some crews abandoned their vehicles after German infantry infiltrated close enough to attack with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails. American doctrine emphasized combined arms operations where infantry, armor, artillery, and air power worked in coordination. The forest negated most of these advantages. Aircraft couldn't observe targets. Artillery couldn't adjust fire effectively. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Infantry fought alone, using weapons and tactics designed for open warfare in terrain that rewarded defenders and punished attackers. In 72 hours, conventional American tactics produced 800 casualties without achieving any primary objectives. The forest demanded something different. Some unit commanders adapted. Captain Charles MacDonald, commanding Company the Fawn, abandoned fire and maneuver in favor of infiltration tactics. His platoons moved in small groups, avoiding trails, using terrain features Germans might not cover. When his scouts detected bunkers, MacDonald called supporting fire from positions outside German observation, then led assault teams that attacked from unexpected directions. These adaptations worked locally, but couldn't scale across the regiment. Each company fought in different terrain with different German dispositions. Tactics that succeeded in one sector failed elsewhere. The forest fragmented the battle into hundreds of small unit actions where centralized control proved impossible and local initiative determined survival. Staff officers at division headquarters struggled to understand what occurred on the ground. Their maps showed advances measured in yards, while casualty reports indicated unsustainable losses. They dispatched liaison officers to forward positions, but these observers spent hours reaching battalion command posts, then returned with reports that described chaos without explaining it. How could a veteran division fail against what intelligence still characterized as limited opposition? General Cota visited the forest on November 14th. He traveled to the 22nd Infantry Command Post, interviewed battalion commanders, examined casualty lists that already exceeded 700 men. Some officers requested permission to halt the offensive and reorganize. Cota refused. His orders from Corps headquarters demanded continued pressure. The strategic situation required breaking through Hürtgen regardless of tactical costs. Could any alternative approach succeed? The answer would emerge through experiments conducted by desperate men under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Hirschfelder authorized his company commanders to modify tactics based on local conditions. This devolution of authority violated standard doctrine that emphasized centralized planning and coordinated execution. But standard doctrine produced results measured in casualties rather than terrain gained. Company commanders developed techniques through trial and error. Some abandoned daylight attacks in favor of night infiltration. Others concentrated forces for overwhelming local superiority, then withdrew before German artillery responded. A few officers led from the front, personally scouting routes and leading assault teams. These approaches produced scattered successes that never accumulated into operational breakthrough. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable through tactical adaptation. German defenders occupied prepared positions in terrain that multiplied their defensive advantages. They held interior lines that allowed rapid reinforcement. They maintained communication and supply through routes American artillery couldn't interdict. Every American gain came at costs that exceeded what the regiment could sustain. Battalion surgeons reported casualties that went beyond killed and wounded. Combat exhaustion cases multiplied. Men broke under sustained artillery fire they couldn't escape. Some soldiers developed thousand-yard stares, becoming unresponsive to orders. Others fled toward the rear, moving past company positions until military police stopped them. A few simply sat in foxholes, refusing to advance even when officers threatened courts-martial. Medical officers noted a pattern they'd never observed before. Soldiers who'd fought through Normandy and across France collapsed in Hürtgen Forest. Veterans with months of combat experience reached breaking points within days of entering the woods. The combination of casualties, conditions, and futility exceeded what training and leadership could overcome. German intelligence reports documented, American morale deteriorates rapidly under forest conditions. Units lose cohesion within 1 week. The problem, replacing destroyed units, required resources the Americans seemed willing to commit indefinitely. By November 18th, the 22nd Infantry had advanced 1.5 miles at a cost exceeding 1,400 casualties. Companies operated at 30% strength. Some platoons consisted of 5 or 6 men. Battalion staff struggled to maintain unit coherence as combat power dissolved through attrition that never paused. Division headquarters sent forward a fresh battalion from the reserve regiment. These troops moved into positions the 22nd Infantry no longer held sufficient strength to occupy. They entered the forest expecting to relieve combat-exhausted soldiers. Instead, they found shattered units holding positions in terrain that defied description. Within 48 hours, the replacement battalion reported casualties exceeding 200 men. The forest consumed units faster than the American replacement system could restore them. Simple mathematics indicated the offensive must fail eventually. Division strength dropped daily. German defensive capabilities remained essentially intact, yet orders continued demanding advance, capture objectives, maintain pressure. Strategic necessity drove operations that tactical reality proved impossible. The 22nd Infantry attempted coordinated battalion-sized attacks on November 20th. Staff officers planned a simultaneous advance by 3 battalions, each supported by artillery concentrations and engineer teams. The operation aimed to overwhelm German defenses through mass and synchronization. Battalion commanders received orders at 0400 hours for attacks commencing at 0800. Coordination failed immediately. The lead battalion crossed its line of departure 20 minutes early when a platoon leader misread the attack order. German artillery responded instantly, catching the other 2 battalions forming up in assembly areas. By 0830, the coordinated attack had devolved into separate, company-level actions occurring at different times across a front where nobody maintained contact with adjacent units. Could synchronized operations work in terrain that prevented communication? The answer came through casualties that exceeded 300 men before noon. Company F attacked toward a bunker complex intelligence identified as a key German position. Captain Bosch led 73 riflemen in an assault that started with artillery preparation. Shells burst in the trees, forcing his men to shelter in place until the barrage lifted. When they advanced, German machine guns opened fire from positions the artillery never touched. The company gained 100 yards, then halted under fire so intense that movement meant death. Bosch called for smoke to cover his withdrawal. Mortar rounds landed short, creating white clouds that drifted back over American positions. His men pulled back through their own smoke screen, while German gunners fired blindly through the haze. Casualties during the withdrawal exceeded those from the attack. Company F ended the day with 41 effectives. Other companies experienced similar results. Each attack penetrated short distances before German fire halted forward movement. Withdrawals proved as costly as advances. By nightfall, the regiment occupied positions nearly identical to those held at dawn. The day's casualties exceeded 400 men for gains measured in yards. That single day's losses multiplied the crisis. Within 48 hours, battalion strength dropped below 50%, and company commanders led platoon-sized units. The regiment approached combat ineffectiveness. Battalion surgeons established aid stations in bunkers, captured during earlier fighting. These facilities operated in mud-floored rooms, lit by candles and flashlights. Wounded soldiers arrived on improvised stretchers, carried by men who risked their lives crossing fire-swept ground. Some casualties waited hours for treatment. Others died during evacuation attempts when German artillery caught stretcher teams in the open. Medical supplies ran short. Bandages, plasma, and morphine required constant resupply through a logistics system that barely functioned in the forest. Jeep ambulances attempted to evacuate wounded along trails that German artillery covered. Some drivers made the run successfully. Others died trying. Casualty evacuation became another combat operation, not a support function. Lieutenant Colonel Hirschfelder requested permission to suspend offensive operations for 48 hours. His battalions needed time to reorganize, integrate replacements, and evacuate wounded. Division headquarters denied the request. Corps demanded continued pressure. The offensive schedule allowed no pause for unit recovery. While the 22nd Infantry bled itself against German bunkers, Wehrmacht engineers completed additional fortifications deeper in the forest. Nobody at American headquarters recognized the trap closing. Replacements arrived in groups of 20 or 30 men. These soldiers came directly from training bases with no combat experience and minimal understanding of forest warfare. Company commanders assigned them to veteran squads, hoping experienced soldiers could teach survival skills quickly enough to matter. Most replacement soldiers became casualties within their first week, some within their first day. The replacement pipeline couldn't match losses. Each day the regiment grew smaller. Staff officers tracked unit strengths that dropped steadily. Company A 87 men, Company B 76, Company C 64. These numbers represented fractions of authorized strength. In some cases, they exceeded actual combat power because they included walking wounded who remained on duty rather than evacuate. Night brought no relief. German patrols infiltrated American positions, probing defenses and gathering intelligence. Some infiltrators penetrated deep enough to attack command posts and supply points. Others laid mines on trails American units would use the next day. A few simply observed, noting positions and strength before withdrawing to report what they'd seen. American patrols attempted similar infiltration. Few succeeded. The Germans knew the terrain intimately. They'd occupied these positions for weeks, mapping every trail and clearing. American soldiers, even veterans, moved through unfamiliar ground, where every sound drew fire and every movement risked ambush. Patrol losses mounted until company commanders stopped sending out teams they knew wouldn't return. German situation reports documented, American patrol activity ceased in most sectors. They huddle in defensive positions awaiting orders to attack. The problem: defensive posture violated every directive from higher command. November 23rd brought renewed attacks. Division headquarters designated this the final push before Thanksgiving. Fresh artillery arrived, nearly 100 guns positioned to support the offensive. Ammunition stocks increased. Engineers brought forward explosives for bunker demolition. Planning emphasized overwhelming firepower applied to specific objectives. The artillery preparation commenced at 0600 hours. For 90 minutes, American guns pounded German positions with high explosive and white phosphorus shells. Forward observers called fire on every known bunker. Thousands of rounds crashed into the forest, creating fires that burned despite the rain. Smoke obscured entire sectors. Staff officers believed nothing could survive such bombardment. Infantry advanced at 0730. They encountered German defenders who emerged from undamaged bunkers to man weapons American artillery never touched. The bombardment destroyed trees and churned mud, but left fortifications intact. Machine gun fire erupted from positions that should have been obliterated. Mortar rounds began falling on American assault troops within minutes of crossing the line of departure. Company G attacked with 58 men, all that remained of a unit that entered the forest, with 187 soldiers. They advanced 200 yards before German fire pinned them in shell holes filling with water. Captain Condon called for artillery support. The fire mission took 40 minutes to execute because forward observers couldn't locate German positions through the smoke and trees. When shells finally arrived, they landed 100 yards behind the target. The company held its position through the day, unable to advance or withdraw. German artillery found them late afternoon. Tree bursts killed 16 men in 10 minutes. Condon ordered withdrawal after dark. His survivors crawled back through terrain they'd crossed that morning. Company G ended November 23rd with 31 effectives. In 5 days, coordinated attacks consumed 100 soldiers without achieving any objective that justified the casualties. Staff planners prepared the next attack. Similar patterns repeated across the regiment. Each attack started with optimistic planning based on artillery support, coordinated movement, and determination. Each ended with casualties, minimal gains, and shattered units. The forest defeated every tactical approach American commanders attempted. By November 26th, the 22nd Infantry existed as a regiment in name only. Its combined strength totaled fewer than 800 combat effectives spread across positions designed for 2,200 soldiers. Some companies operated with 20 men. Battalions commanded forces smaller than reinforced platoons. The unit approached complete combat ineffectiveness. Staff officers recommended withdrawing the regiment for reconstitution. Division commanders refused. The offensive continued because strategic plans required it, regardless of tactical impossibility. Orders arrived directing the 22nd Infantry to attack again on November 28th, this time toward objectives that included Highway 399 and the village of Großau. What could 800 exhausted soldiers accomplish against defenses that had defeated 2,200 fresh troops? Private MacDonald detected movement in the pre-dawn darkness of November 28th. His position overlooked a trail junction where German infiltrators had appeared twice during the previous night. He waited, finger on his rifle trigger, trying to distinguish shapes in the blackness. The sound repeated. 3 figures materialized from the forest, moving with the careful steps of experienced soldiers. MacDonald fired. The figures scattered. Return fire came from positions he hadn't detected. Bullets snapped through branches overhead as he dropped into his foxhole. This pattern defined the 22nd Infantry's final push. Individual soldiers fought isolated actions while larger operations disintegrated around them. MacDonald's platoon, reduced to 7 men, defended a sector normally held by 40. They couldn't patrol. They barely maintained perimeter security. When orders came to attack at 800 hours, they advanced because refusing meant courts-martial, not because they believed success possible. That morning's attack sealed the regiment's fate. What happened in the next 72 hours would exceed even the pessimistic casualty projections. Lieutenant Ripperdan led Company K's assault element. His 34 soldiers represented what remained of a company that started the Forest battle with 187 men. They crossed the line of departure into ground mist that reduced visibility to 15 yards. German artillery caught them 200 yards forward. Shells burst in the canopy, sending steel fragments through the mist. Ripperdan watched men fall without seeing what hit them. He ordered his survivors into shell holes, trying to find cover where none existed. The company lost 11 men in 20 minutes without engaging any German infantry. Ripperdan radioed battalion headquarters, reporting his position and requesting further orders. The radio operator received instructions to continue the attack. Ripperdan stared at the handset, unable to comprehend how staff officers expected 23 men to accomplish what 187 had failed to achieve 3 weeks earlier. He led his soldiers forward. They moved through terrain littered with debris from earlier battles, abandoned equipment, destroyed vehicles, bodies nobody had time to recover. Some remains dated from the opening attacks. Others came from fighting the previous day. The regiment advanced through its own graveyard, stepping over evidence of every failed assault. German machine guns opened fire from a bunker complex intelligence reports never mentioned. Ripperdan's lead squad dropped flat. 2 men didn't rise. The survivors crawled toward flanking positions, trying to locate the guns for suppressive fire. More German weapons opened up. The Americans found themselves in a kill zone where multiple bunkers provided interlocking fire across approaches they couldn't avoid. Could anyone escape? The answer would come through individual acts of survival rather than organized withdrawal. Hours passed. Company K remained pinned in position, unable to advance or retreat. Ammunition ran low. Ripperdan distributed what remained, knowing they couldn't sustain combat much longer. Radio contact with battalion failed as the battery died. They occupied a position nobody could locate on a map, surrounded by German positions nobody had detected, fighting a battle nobody could win. At 14:30 hours, German artillery began hitting their position. Ripperdan recognized the pattern. Forward observers had pinpointed their location. Shells marched across the perimeter, methodically covering every possible shelter. Tree bursts multiplied the effect. Men died in foxholes they dug for protection. The barrage continued for 40 minutes, longer than most soldiers could remember experiencing. When the shelling stopped, Ripperdan counted 11 survivors from his 23-man force. Most were wounded. All were shocked. He made the decision battalion command should have made: withdraw. His survivors crawled back through the forest, dragging wounded who couldn't walk. German machine gunners tracked their movement, firing bursts that forced the Americans to shelter repeatedly. The withdrawal took 4 hours to cover 400 yards. Company K reached American lines after dark with 7 men. 4 others died during evacuation or went missing in the forest. Ripperdan reported to battalion headquarters, delivering casualty numbers that staff officers recorded without comment. The company ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Its survivors joined other fragments being consolidated into composite platoons. Similar disasters occurred across the regiment's front that day. Company after company attacked according to plan, encountered overwhelming German resistance, and withdrew with casualties that ended their combat effectiveness. By nightfall, November 28th, The 22nd Infantry reported losses exceeding 450 men for gains measured in yards. Under darkness, battalion surgeons worked through casualty lists that overwhelmed medical facilities. Aid stations received wounded faster than doctors could treat them. Some soldiers died waiting for care. Others evacuated themselves, walking to the rear until they collapsed. The regiment's medical system, designed for supporting 2,100 soldiers, struggled to handle casualties that represented complete unit destruction. Replacement soldiers arrived that night. These 150 men came directly from processing centers with minimal training and no forest combat experience. Staff officers assigned them to companies that existed in name only, filling gaps in organizations that had ceased functioning as coherent units. Most replacements entered combat within 12 hours of arrival. Many became casualties before learning their squad leaders' names. While American units disintegrated, German defenders maintained positions that had withstood 3 weeks of attack. The mathematics predicted collapse. November 29th brought orders for continued offensive operations. Division headquarters directed the 22nd Infantry to attack toward objectives that included Grossau and Highway 399. Battalion commanders received these orders with disbelief. Their units couldn't sustain further combat. Company strengths averaged 25 men. Ammunition, medical supplies, and food required constant resupply through routes German artillery covered. Morale had collapsed beyond what leadership could restore. Lieutenant Colonel Hirschfelder reported his assessment to division. The regiment required immediate relief and reconstitution. Division staff acknowledged the report, but denied the request. Strategic planning required continued pressure. Corps demanded results. Army-level operations depended on breaking through the forest. The 22nd Infantry would attack. Captain Pina led what remained of Companies E and I in a combined assault. The two units totaled 47 combat-effective soldiers attempting to accomplish a mission designed for 400. They advanced at over 900 hours into German fire that started immediately. Pina watched his force shrink as men fell to machine guns, artillery, and mines that covered every approach. His assault lasted 90 minutes before German fire forced withdrawal. The combined company lost 23 men. Survivors retreated to positions they'd occupied at dawn. Pina reported to battalion that further attacks would accomplish nothing except additional casualties. Staff officers recorded his report, then issued orders for another attack the following morning. That night, German forces launched their own offensive. Wehrmacht units that had defended throughout November attacked American positions, seeking to drive back forces that threatened their defensive system. German infantry infiltrated through positions the 22nd Infantry no longer held sufficient strength to defend. Machine gun teams set up in locations that allowed them to fire into American rear areas. Mortar crews registered fire on trails American reinforcements would use. The regiment found itself defending against coordinated attacks while still under orders to continue its own offensive. Companies engaged German infantry from multiple directions. Platoons fought, surrounded by enemies who materialized from the darkness. Individual soldiers defended positions alone after their squads died or scattered. The forest battle descended into chaos where nobody controlled anything beyond arm's length. How many more would die? The answer came through decisions made at headquarters far from the forest. December 1st brought the regiment's final attack. Orders directed a 2-battalion assault toward objectives that included Highway 399. Staff planners allocated artillery support from every available gun. Engineers prepared demolition charges for bunker reduction. Medical units positioned ambulances for casualty evacuation. The operation incorporated lessons from 3 weeks of fighting and resources from across the division. The attack commenced at 0800 hours. German artillery responded within 2 minutes, hitting American assembly areas with pre-registered fire. Battalions attempting to cross their lines of departure took casualties before engaging any enemy infantry. Forward progress halted within 30 minutes, as German machine guns opened fire from positions American scouts never detected. Company A, reinforced to 62 men through consolidation with other units, advanced 150 yards before German fire pinned them. Captain Boesch, commanding the composite force, tried calling artillery support. Forward observers couldn't see targets through the forest. Fire missions landed ineffectively, while German gunners maintained their positions. Company A held its ground through the morning, losing men to artillery and sniper fire, unable to advance or withdraw. By 1300 hours, the attack had failed across the entire regimental front. Every company reported heavy casualties and minimal progress. Battalion commanders requested permission to withdraw and consolidate. Division staff granted the request, acknowledging what ground-level officers had reported for days: the 22nd Infantry no longer existed as an effective fighting force. Withdrawal operations continued through December 2nd. Companies pulled back from positions they'd held at terrible cost. German forces didn't pursue aggressively, content to have stopped the American advance. The 22nd Infantry extracted from Hürtgen Forest in small groups, moving through terrain they'd crossed weeks earlier. The ground they abandoned represented their farthest penetration, purchased with casualties that exceeded sustainable limits. Medical facilities processed soldiers who emerged from the forest physically and mentally shattered. Doctors treated wounds, frostbite, trench foot, combat exhaustion, and conditions they couldn't diagnose. Some men required hospitalization, others needed psychiatric care. A few simply sat, staring at nothing, unable to respond to questions or follow basic instructions. Staff officers compiled casualty reports that documented complete unit destruction. The 22nd Infantry entered Hürtgen Forest with 2,200 combat soldiers. It emerged with fewer than 300 men rated combat effective. The regiment had ceased to exist as a fighting organization. Replacement and reconstitution would require months, removing the unit from offensive operations for the remainder of 1944. During 23 days in Hürtgen Forest, the 22nd Infantry Regiment suffered 2,773 casualties from a starting strength of 2,200 soldiers. This represented a 126% casualty rate, accounting for replacements fed into combat who became casualties within days or hours of arrival. The regiment lost every company commander, most platoon leaders, and casualties across all ranks that exceeded any sustainable calculation. The numbers seemed impossible. Some companies reported 200% casualty rates when replacement soldiers died faster than records could track them. But after-action reports confirmed every detail through systematic documentation. German defenders suffered approximately 1,400 casualties defending the sector against the 22nd Infantry's attacks. Their casualty exchange ratio of nearly 2.1 reflected advantages terrain provided and defensive tactics that maximized those advantages. Wehrmacht units remained combat effective throughout the battle, rotating forces and maintaining defensive integrity the Americans never achieved. The regiment advanced 1.6 miles at a cost of 1,732 casualties per mile. This rate exceeded casualties from any comparable American operation in the European theater. Omaha Beach, often cited as the bloodiest day for American forces, produced 2,400 casualties across multiple units. The 22nd Infantry suffered comparable losses confined to a single regiment over 3 weeks. That single regiment's destruction multiplied across the entire forest. Within 6 weeks, 7 American divisions entered Hürtgen, 4 emerged combat ineffective. Total casualties exceeded 33,000 soldiers. The forest became America's longest single battle in the European theater. Strategic impact extended beyond casualty numbers. The Hürtgen offensive failed to achieve its primary objectives. Highway 399 remained under German control. The Rhine River dams, the ultimate strategic goal, stayed in Wehrmacht hands. German forces continued threatening Allied flanks through December. The offensive consumed resources and time the Americans couldn't recover before the Battle of the Bulge. Military analysts later questioned the entire Hürtgen strategy. The forest could have been bypassed, isolating German defenders without direct assault. Alternative approaches existed that wouldn't have destroyed 7 divisions. Yet command decisions prioritized terrain control over force preservation, producing casualties that weakened American strength before Germany's final offensive. Tactical lessons emerged slowly. The Army eventually published studies documenting what the 22nd Infantry learned through blood. Forest combat required specialized training, modified tactics, different equipment, and realistic assessment of what infantry could accomplish in restrictive terrain. These lessons influenced post-war doctrine, particularly training for combat in Europe's central forests. Would future soldiers benefit from what the 22nd Infantry discovered? In 96 hours after Hürtgen, doctrine writers compiled reports that transformed American forest combat training. Units preparing for Germany studied the 22nd Infantry's experience as warning rather than example. Post-war doctrine emphasized avoiding forest combat when possible. When unavoidable, modified tactics stressed infiltration over frontal assault, small unit actions over battalion-sized attacks, and accepting limited gains rather than pursuing breakthrough objectives. The Army developed specialized equipment, including Bangalore torpedoes for bunker assault, improved communication systems for forest operations, and vehicles designed for restricted terrain. Training programs incorporated Hürtgen lessons. Infantry schools taught forest combat as a distinct environment requiring specific preparation. Officer courses analyzed the 22nd Infantry's battles, emphasizing what worked and what failed. Some veterans became instructors, sharing survival techniques they'd learned when standard doctrine proved inadequate. The 22nd Infantry reconstituted during spring 1945. The regiment received replacements, new equipment, and training before returning to combat. It participated in operations through Germany's final collapse, fighting in terrain where lessons from Hürtgen proved valuable. The unit avoided similar disasters, demonstrating that institutional learning occurred even as individual survivors struggled with memories the forest created. Lieutenant Colonel Hirschfelder survived the battle, later commanding at higher levels. He never discussed Hürtgen publicly, following a pattern common among survivors who couldn't articulate what occurred in those woods. His post-war career included training assignments where he influenced doctrine development, ensuring future soldiers understood what his regiment learned through catastrophic losses. Captain Bosch remained in service, eventually retiring as a colonel. He wrote extensively about Hürtgen, attempting to explain forest combat to audiences who couldn't comprehend conditions that defeated conventional tactics. His writings influenced training programs and military education, preserving lessons that might otherwise have been forgotten as survivors died. Sergeant Ripperdan left the Army after Germany's surrender. He returned to St. Louis, married, raised a family, and worked 40 years without telling anyone about Hürtgen Forest. Only late in life did he discuss his experiences, participating in veteran reunions and oral history projects. His accounts documented the soldiers' perspective on battles that staff officers never understood. How could anyone explain what occurred in those woods to people who never entered them? Private MacDonald survived multiple wounds, earning a Purple Heart and Bronze Star. He returned home to Detroit, struggled with nightmares and anxiety, eventually finding stability through veteran support programs. He never returned to Germany, never visited the forest where he'd fought. His children learned about his service through military records rather than conversation. The forest remained too painful to discuss even decades later. German defenders who survived Hürtgen rarely discussed the battle publicly. Their war ended in defeat, making detailed accounts of successful defensive operations uncomfortable topics. Some wrote memoirs that acknowledged American determination while noting that terrain advantages proved decisive. A few participated in veteran reunions, meeting former enemies in the forest they defended, finding common understanding in shared trauma. The forest itself recovered slowly. Trees grew through destroyed bunkers. Vegetation covered shell holes and trenches. By the 1970s, casual visitors saw peaceful woodland, not a battlefield that had consumed entire regiments. Preserved fortifications and marked trails eventually created a memorial landscape where historians and descendants could attempt understanding what occurred. Historians continue debating Hürtgen's necessity and conduct. Some argue the offensive served strategic purposes that justified casualties. Others characterize it as a disaster resulting from flawed planning and stubborn execution. The 22nd Infantry's experience provides evidence for both interpretations, demonstrating both determination and futility in battles where ground-level reality never matched command expectations. The regiment's 126% casualty rate stands as the highest recorded for any American unit in sustained combat during World War II. This statistic represents not only deaths and wounds, but the systematic destruction of unit cohesion, leadership, and combat effectiveness. The number encompasses soldiers who died quickly and those who suffered lingering deaths from wounds, exposure, or psychological trauma that lasted decades. What choice would commanders make, knowing these costs before attacking? The question haunted post-war analysis and influenced how the Army approached similar operations. Private MacDonald's daughter found his medals and discharge papers after his death in 1987. She researched his service, learning about Hürtgen Forest and the 22nd Infantry's casualties. She never understood why he'd never mentioned serving in the war's longest battle. The forest took more than lives. It took voices, leaving survivors unable to speak about experiences that shaped the remainder of their days. Hürtgen Forest stood where conventional military logic met terrain that rewarded defense and punished attack. The 22nd Infantry's destruction proved that determination, courage, and standard tactics couldn't overcome fundamental disadvantages. The regiment learned this through casualties that exceeded any reasonable calculation, through battles that destroyed units faster than they could be replaced, through experiences that veterans couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. The forest kept its secrets until survivors started dying. Only then did accounts emerge, fragmentary and painful, attempting to preserve lessons purchased with blood. The 22nd Infantry's story became a cautionary tale about matching tactics to terrain, about questioning orders that ignored ground-level reality, about costs that exceeded any strategic gain. Lieutenant Colonel Hirschfelder lived until 1978, dying without publicly discussing the forest that defined his service. His personnel file noted distinguished service, multiple decorations, and successful command at various levels. It didn't capture what he experienced watching his regiment dissolve through casualties no planning had anticipated and no doctrine could prevent. The forest remained with him, as it remained with every survivor, until the end.